Estamos el día de hoy, ¿se escucha? Sí, estamos el día de hoy junto a Jonathan Sklar y a Jorge Bruce, teniendo la última actividad académica y de compartir experiencias de la Cátedra de Psicoanálisis Británico que corresponde a este año. Gracias a Moisés. Siempre agradeceré a Moisés por darnos la oportunidad de poder seguir pensando, construyendo y enriqueciéndonos con estas experiencias. La cátedra empezó este miércoles con la conferencia anual del múltiple interés en psicoanálisis. Han habido después espacios de compartir y supervisión, uno desde una perspectiva comunitaria de trabajo con población en vulnerabilidad y otro más bien desde una perspectiva más bien clínica, tanto con estudiantes de la maestría en intervención clínica psicoanalítica de la Escuela de Posgrado de la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, como con los miembros y candidatos de la Sociedad Peruana de Psicoanálisis. El día de hoy tenemos la conferencia con la que se cierra este encuentro. La conferencia es una conferencia que creo que nos convoca a todos, muy especialmente en pensar nuestro contexto, en pensar nuestra realidad y en pensar, digamos, lo que hemos ido viviendo como ciudadanos, miembros de un país, profesionales, en nuestro Perú. La conferencia de clausura lleva de título Violencia, destrucción y supervivencia. Teoría independiente y práctica clínica en estados de regresión. Para quienes no tuvieron oportunidad de estar en las actividades previas, tengo el gusto de presentar a Jonathan Sklar. Él se formó en medicina en el Royal Free Universidad de Londres en 1973, se especializó en psiquiatría en Friern y el Royal Free en 1977. Realizó su formación en psicoterapia psicoanalítica en el departamento de adultos del Tamilton Center durante 4 años, trabajando con adultos, niños y adolescentes, así como en grupos grandes y pequeños entre 1979 y 1983. Al mismo tiempo se formó en el Instituto de Psicoanálisis y ha sido psicoanalista desde 1983 y analista de formación desde 1996. Fue psicoterapeuta consultor y jefe del departamento de psicoterapia en los hospitales de Addenbrooke's and Fulbourn en Cambridge, en 1984 a 1996. Ha sido líder de grupos Balin durante 25 años, trabajando con médicos de cabecera y psiquiatras. Recibió un doctorado honorario en psicoterapia otorgado por la Sociedad Médica Serbia en Belgrado en 2012. Es miembro honorario de la Asociación Psicoanalítica Sudafricana desde el 2016, miembro honorario de la Sociedad Psicoanalítica de Serbia desde el 2016, es presidente de Independent Psychoanalyst Trust. Actualmente se dedica a tiempo completo a su práctica privada en el norte de Londres. La conferencia va a ser comentada por Coqui Bruce. Él modestamente me ha mandado 3 líneas de presentación. Licenciado en Psicología por la PUC, máster en la Universidad de París, psicoanalista de la Sociedad Peruana de Psicoanálisis, autor de diversos libros de psicoanálisis, cultura y sociedad y columnista del diario La República. También me dijo que no lo diga, y yo le dije, voy a decir exactamente lo que estoy diciendo, que gana, es campeón del campeonato de tenis entre artistas e intelectuales. Entonces, bueno, vale la pena decirlo, como siempre, Entiendo que la conferencia de hoy se va a basar en un caso de clínica privada. Por tanto, como corresponde a nuestra práctica y a nuestra ética, ¿no? Pasaré a leer una declaración de confidencialidad, ¿no? Asumiendo el compromiso de cada uno de nosotros para el cuidado ético del material clínico, que hoy con confianza nos ofrece el doctor Sklar. Tengo 3 lentes y ninguno me sirve para leer. Voy a... ¿Okay? Declaración de confidencialidad. Ruego a la audiencia que respete la confidencialidad del material clínico que expongan los conferencistas. Aprovecho para recordarles que es en principio ético fundamental de nuestro quehacer el mantener la total discreción sobre el material de este tipo, sea visto o escuchado. Si usted asiste a una sesión en la que se presenta o discute material clínico y reconoce la identidad del paciente, debe proteger la confidencialidad de dicho paciente abandonando en silencio la sesión. Se deben evitar las conversaciones sobre el material clínico en áreas públicas. Asimismo, es preciso evitar el envío de correos electrónicos y mensajes de Internet que contengan material clínico. Cada uno de nosotros dejamos constancia de que el anuncio de declaración precedente fue realizado al inicio de esta sesión del Congreso. Gracias.
Tengo que hacer 3 avisos. Primero, por favor, apaguen todos el Wi-Fi de su celular porque el Zoom se transmite por Wi-Fi, entonces para que tengamos mejor calidad de Internet. Segundo, bajen el volumen de sus celulares. Y tercero, hablen despacio cuando vayan a participar para que la traductora pueda hacer mejor su trabajo. Gracias.
Voy a apagar mi Wi-Fi. Bueno, sin más, doy paso al doctor Jonathan Sklar.
Buenos dias. First, thank you very much for welcoming me. I feel very welcomed here, both in the university and in the society. The title is going to be about clinical work, but the title can also be a description of the times we live in. So, in relation to my earlier paper on metaphor, one can also think about the destruction now as well. So I'm going to examine states of regression, severe states of mind in which the analysand has no belief in trust of another person, and why and how such states come into unconscious formation. To begin with, regression functions as a profound defense that concurrently forces that person to only rely on the self. This in turn has enormous repercussions on the life lived, diminishing it in somatic and psychic ways, and developing a particular sort of private life. I've shortened the paper just a little bit, and Jorge has told me that the bit that I have shortened is exactly the bit that he wants to talk about. So I just want to draw your attention again to the poem about Rockabye Baby, which I talked about in my previous lecture, and what Winnicott thought about that, about mothers, because it is germane to this paper, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you make of that as well. Okay. The analyst may find that the analysand may not be able to hear or accept interpretation, digest it, work it through. The patient may not know that another person is even in the room with them. Now, this is strange because we will see that there's a patient there, but I've learned to not assume that the patient can see and recognize me. You know, I might be a piece of furniture because that's safer. The analyst's sentences and interpretations might be heard not as words, but as things, recalling Freud's differentiation between word presentation and thing presentation. When the analyst does speak, the patient may perceive the sentence as a device to penetrate. So great care must be taken in trying to imagine which part of the body receives the interpretation when the patient is in a state of pathological regression. Ernest Jones wrote a wonderful paper where he showed that words are not necessarily received into the ears, but can be felt as entering another body space with all the imaginary dangers of where the penetration might be. Words at times contain the capacity to be experienced physically in the body as seduction or aggression. Some analysans present the near impossibility of reaching someone who has almost given up the possibility of being found by another. Playing games of hide and seek that can be very painful, such as the life of patients who find a way of clinging to a marginal life through psychotic mechanisms, with delusional thought, with drug-induced aloneness, or a retreat into somatization. In all such clinical encounters, the movement from the solipsistic world to a two-person relationship, which implies transference and the possibility of refinding the Oedipal world of three persons, infant, mother, and father, becomes available only by registering an antecedent traumatic landscape. This is often, as I'm sure you know, deeply buried, hidden beneath the surface, possibly, as Abraham and Torok say, with all traces kicked over. No one knows where it is. The patient has lost it, and the analyst doesn't even know where to look. To my mind, it's a bit like how you, in Peru, come across things buried in the desert. Somehow you kick over the traces and find extraordinary objects. Winnicott postulates a process in which something so awful that was actually seen by a child can lead to a dehallucination in which it's just covered over. Subsequently, a hallucination fills up the hole produced by the scotomization. He described watching a child paint a picture using bright colors to portray a lively scene, a house, a mother and a father, the child painting it and a sibling. Bright colors portraying a lively scene. And then Winnicott notices that this was quickly followed by the child finding black paint and carefully and completely covering the first scene, wiping out the earlier representation. Now, if one had not observed the beginning, one would be left to speculate only about the blackness of the picture of the child. And Winnicott describes such a process as compulsive, in that it had to be repeated again and again. Now, this very slight example reveals the importance of keeping the mind open to a historical line of inquiry. But without such a capacity, it's easy to promote the idea that the child's black picture is a representation of death instinct. Clearly, these representations, layered one on top of the other, convey a much more complex picture. Some patients need to be psychotic in order to arrive at memories of a very disturbed and distressing kind belonging to earlier times. Like the black paint of the child, psychosis is a representation of the dark landscape, concealing and pointing towards early severe trauma. Hallucinations are a form of creative life, like dreams. Winnicott's observation also contains the idea that it is the patient who now has the desire and the capacity to black something. Now the past and the present reach a fusion that requires analysis to untangle the original black that assaulted the child and their own identification with blackening, blanking out, that is both self-protective and an attack on the object. Any affect is projected onto the surface of the picture in the flatness of the color, black covering the other pigments, and far from the internal feelings of affect. By becoming an artist, the damaged child is unconsciously attempting to find a new location for a description of the trauma on paper as a picture or a poem, which can then be externalized. We should not be misled, however, into thinking that such transcription, can be consciously understood by the patient as an important retrieval of early life. As with painting, the process is more tentative. Good enough art has the capacity to allow the viewer to be unconsciously in touch with something of the poignancy of this early unconscious human situation. In such cases, something unbearable is struggling for representation. Ferenczi was particularly interested in finding the balance between fantasy and trauma. He wrote to Freud on December the 25th, 1929, Christmas, they didn't stop their work. In all cases in which I've penetrated deeply enough, he wrote, I found the traumatic hysterical basis for the illness. The critical view that gradually formed in me in the process was that psychoanalysis engages too much one-sidedly in obsessional neurosis and character analysis, i.e. ego psychology, neglecting the organic hysterical basis for the analysis. The cause lies in the overestimation of fantasy and the underestimation of traumatic reality in pathogenesis. End of quote. Similarly, in my clinical work, it's the gradual, or in sometimes the sudden and unexpected tripping over traumatic memories that can bring analysis to life. The difficulty in this area is that the return of the repressed trauma can become diffused into the transference countertransference. It's likely that a sudden violent aggression can erupt, such as the patient coming close to attacking themselves, perhaps not for the first time, and or perceiving the analyst as a perpetrator and hence repeater of the original sense of trauma that may have been experienced. Of course, such moments can signal an imminent assault on the analyst. Ferenczi found his own mind in relation to some clinical material in the countertransference to his patient. And in analyzing patients with severe environmental failure, the analyst thus has to bear being perceived as the attacker, perhaps even the murderer. And I'm thinking about soul murder in the transference. The material intermingles present and past without the patient or analyst necessarily being too overwhelmed by paranoia. The capacity to work in such a clinically restricted area to both understand and to survive is a prelude to Michael Barlandt's concept of the new beginning. It's a matter of finding a way of getting beneath the blackness which may appear as emptiness or an evacuated state of the patient. Otherwise, it's all too easy for the analyst to assume that blackness is bedrock and to make the case for negative therapeutic reaction, essentially blaming the patient again. This may trigger the sudden departure of the patient, leaving intact the analyst's unassailable sense that the patient was just unanalyzable. Unfortunately, such a position can simply allow a non-understanding of what suddenly happened, and to protect the analyst from criticism, his own as well as others. What is lost is the analyst's capacity to notice his enactment at play, at the traumatic scene returning from its usual habitat of being repressed. It's not a surprise to postulate that the unconscious of some analysts, being fearful about the deep waters they may have stumbled into, can offer a dullness of response that indicates to the patient that they're not really wanted, warts and all. So such a patient may well be right to depart the battle. In the area of object relating, Winnicott later theorized in a similar way, quote, after the subject relates to object comes subject destroys object, and then may come object survives destruction by the subject. That's 1971, Winnicott. Sometimes after this, he continued, the object can be loved. Winnicott does not quote Ferenczi, but the two share a belief in the importance of surviving being killed in the transference, which implies that the analyst must be available for such death. Once he survives, the patient, invariably astonished, can begin to know about the usefulness of being able to love. It is the capacity to love that is so strikingly absent when such ill patients first arrive in the consulting room. Not that it's even something to be considered or even complained about. This capacity to love also needs to include loving with ambivalence, allowing hatred of the object. With such ill patients, interpretation is used later, I think, in the analytic work, when the analysand has dared, as it were, we could call this developed, to notice the other in the room. The very regressed patient may need to deal with life by having very little of it. One way of dealing with profound early traumas is to close down much of oneself in order to provide as small a target as possible for the expectation of further mental and physical assault. The depth of trauma can be registered by the amount of empty time required for such a character to dare seek an object again. This can be an act of considerable bravery for the analysand, who has to refine traumatic moments which have been effectively repressed, split off, or somatized. Prior to such a return to hope, the analysand has first to find a creative part of himself as a form of becoming alive. Such matters may go on separately to the analysis, which might seem empty and sterile for long periods of time. The analyst needs to be patient and not misread such moments as stasis, as negative transference, or resistance of analytic process. Patients can only find their way to the analyst in their own time and often with their own interpretation. And for some analysands, everything that has been offered from the early carers was so tainted with self-servingness that they've developed a form of primitive knowledge or impulse to accept nothing from the other person. Technically, one needs to wait without despair. External reason is felt as an attack. The patient is in an unreachable place, yet knowing, despite all else, that the patient daily attends their analysis is a hopeful sign. That is a great deal and can be a form of silent participation by just being there rather than resistance. This can be a most unusual experience for the very ill patient who's been filled with an earlier knowledge of what the other wants for himself. Michael Barlint described an area of the basic fault where the patient is silent, lifeless, and hopeless. Such a phase, Enid Barlint later elaborated, quote, "It's only overcome when this phase is worked through, that is, when the patient is no longer regressed to a stage where he has no mutual experience with his analyst, but becomes silently hostile, disillusioned, and desperate, and eventually appears to give up hope. He sometimes does this without reproaching the analyst, who may wonder what he's doing wrong. This state is overcome only when the patient painfully allows himself to feel alone in the analyst's presence, but with no person being there. He may then begin to perceive for himself to enter the area of creativity. The patient is alone with no other person present, but, Enid says, the space is not empty. There's no experience of a void, and the analytic hour is in fact a relief from the previous experience of compliance, unquote. So for Enid Barland, entering a creativeness alone in the presence of the other is a direction of the analytic journey and must occur prior to the patient recognizing the meaning of a two-person relationship. This does not mean that the relationship has not been noticed. Rather, it's not been perceived as important. It only becomes so when it matures into a two-person relationship, which must include at times the painful realization of absence. At such a time, creative play like thumb sucking is recognized as not providing the real thing. Realizing the loss of the other becomes a later and critical experience on that developmental path in analysis. It includes the desire for the lost object no longer in the realms of a return to a damaging sadomasochistic experience, but in the form of a new experience gradually built on trust and concern. That this is not a falsely positive vision is clear from Winnicott's insistence on destruction and survival as an inherent part of the process. Such states of mind contain paradoxes. Quote, Winnicott, at the start is an essential aloneness. At the same time, this aloneness can only take place under maximum conditions of dependence. Unquote. Likewise, Christopher Bolas eloquently describes the mutuality at times of the destructive process as an essential component to being alive. Quote, the analyst destroys the patient's manifest text in order to reveal unconscious meanings, and the patient destroys the analyst through that particular object usage we call transference, unquote. I suggest, he continues, that for a good destruction of the analyst to take place, one that is not constituted out of the death instinct, but is part of the life instinct, the analyst must indicate to the patient at the right moment that he is ready for destruction. The to-be destroyed analyst has a different function, indeed is a different object from that analyst who deconstructs the material, unquote. If this seems somewhat formalized as something known that will occur during a moment in the session, in my experience, it's rather some other place or atmosphere that one unwittingly finds oneself. It's like being in a cold, horrible, unfriendly, and frankly dangerous dark landscape. When working with such severely damaged patients, such moments are far more than a counter-transferential invitation for the analyst to enter the experience of the analysand all those years ago, in order to have some emotional being in the moment of what it may have felt like then. Rather, or in addition, it feels as if the analyst's capacity to imagine that he can even do analytic work is being destroyed at times. In fact, the patient's directing unconscious attention to a rock bottom to see in the midst of such an experience, is the analyst still alive? The idea of enactment can be viewed as an activity to draw the analyst into acting out, therefore strengthening the patient's defenses. It is as if the patient desires only to wrong-foot the analyst and attack analysis. This is a very different way of thinking to the idea that enactment might be a way, or even the only way sometimes, of retrieving past object states. Even if the analyst does allow that a certain degree of his own acting out may be inevitable, such a recognition serves to secure the analyst at a distance, trying to beware as an external and rational observer. This is far from the analyst described by Michael Barlint, caught up in an interpenetrating mix-up, who needs to be experienced as malignant before being found as harmonious with the patient. In the independent tradition, the negative is used and is perceived less antagonistic to the direction of therapeutics and without necessarily indicating an attack on analysis. The demand on the analyst is profound. It's like approaching the pull of a black hole that can invoke its own past negative and traumatic experiences of the analyst. Barlint gave no clinical vignettes of malignant regression, nor to how technically develop in analysis such transitions in object relations. And I hope the case that I'm now going to describe will add to the development of Barlint's ideas on moving from understanding the basic fault to a realization of an interpenetrating harmonious mix-up and the formation of a more mature unconscious object relationship. So I come to my case, which is the treatment of a schizophrenic analysand. I'm returning to a case first discussed in my first book, Landscapes of the Dark, in 2011, to further examine what took place in that analysis, and in particular, to examine its ending, which I hadn't commented about. Mrs. A wanted analysis as she felt desperate at her worsening sense of not being able to care for herself. She was anorexic. She cut and excoriated her body in secret, keeping this secret from a high-functioning and demanding job. She'd been diagnosed as schizophrenic during several periods of psychiatric hospitalization in the years before. Declining medication and feeling that her treatment had been slight, she made clear that she wanted an analysis to understand herself and the content of her mind. Initially attending 6 sessions weekly, she began our work in a regressed silence. She wasn't interested in the couch, and she opted to sit on the wooden floor in the far corner of the room, abject with her head hung low. Presenting an indifference to being in the session, she observed acutely despite giving the appearance to the contrary. Perhaps surprisingly, outside the consulting room, her ideas and concern for others' care was well known in the community, and she was much respected. Yet this carapace was instantly shed when she entered the analytic space. In between sessions, she continued to deliberately slice her upper arms, sometimes her breast, and she would explore her vagina and anus with a knife. After such attacks, the way she sat on the floor was a silent indication of the soreness of her body. It is such violent activity that I want to particularly discuss here, rather than other things that I could talk about the case. Usually, if Mrs. A told me of such activity, it was in an affectless manner, and she may remain surprised that I was affected by the horror of the activity. She'd banished all feeling and projected herself as nothing and worthless. Thus, cutting was of no consequence to her or for her. It was a piece of enacted sadomasochism, quite separate from her. In time, she was able to recognize the internal battle of her internal voice, demanding a cut, implying she'd get relief. She once brought to the session this cruel nighttime demand by thinking about analysis, her analyst, and the room we worked in, as well as holding some pieces of gravel that she'd taken from my driveway. The nightly fight was won or lost, and if she failed to draw blood, the battle for survival the next night was heightened, seemingly to demand a blood sacrifice. The analyst is placed on a tightrope. If I'm silent, the patient's left to think that I too don't mind the cutting of flesh and may even ignore it like her. Also, the silent analyst may be perceived as being silent like the mother, who did not speak up against what her husband was doing to the child, as I was beginning to hear. If I interpreted her cruelty in relation to the patient-analyst couple, it was understood in a surface intellectual way, but the patient would still be left with the great problem of repetition. Yet what really mattered was whether transferentially the analyst was indifferent to what was going on, like her parents. It seemed essential. She was able to begin to see the pain she was able to emotionally inflict onto the other. Hence, slow, surreptitious looks and glances at me to see my face, my posture. The clinical work often seemed to be in the following arenas of unconscious object relations. Was the patient in the room with a primary love father in the transference? Is the transference about a sadistic bully attacker and rapist, who the patient has to be very careful of inciting? Is the patient in the transference the child, who in identification with a cruel father, she was also tormenting? So this would require the analyst to be in the position of voyeur. Furthermore, it is possible within the complexities of ideas to think all of this from the opposite psychic position, that the analyst is at the behest of a bullying mental assault. Both require to be thought about and in time interpreted. And to add to the complexity, what about the maternal object? Was mother ignored, wiped out? Or beneath that layer, was she part of the sadism and perversity of the couple? Constantly watching the analyst at the same time as disavowing doing it, with slight glances, was her way of avoiding contact while simultaneously looking out for the next attack. The next section I have titled "The Patient's Wish to Murder the Analyst." Well, you can see I'm still here, so you don't have to worry too much. One day, Mrs. A had secretly brought a carving knife into the session, and acting with stealth to stab me to death as the voice that she could hear demanded. It's of interest that I can report on the occasion that this happened, I had a sixth sense of some impending assault. In my countertransference, I felt an ambivalence of intense tiredness at the task of analysis and alert to the minute details of my patient's physicality in the room. It was a double thing. Even before the knife was made manifest, wrapped inside a towel, itself inside a large handbag, I'd interpreted, following 10 minutes of anxious, painful silence, that there seemed to be a massive attack going on in the room, causing her much anxiety. This led the patient slowly exposing the knife, saying she wanted to plunge it into me as a way of appeasing the voices. I offered to look after the knife. Her relief was intense when she carefully gave me the knife handle to look after. I mean, at that moment, it's terribly important how you receive the object. You don't receive the object with the knife actually pointing to me. She turned it round and pointed the handle at me. So you have to be mindful of how the process can work. Otherwise, it's extremely dangerous. She was hugely grateful of the care given to her at being able to share her cruel hatred towards the other, which also contained, fused together, I thought, her desire for revenge against her parents. There are many ways to think about this material. Was the knife a phallic object? Whose phallus? Father's, mother's, her own sexual confusion? Was it a representation of sexual pairing? Is it close to murder or soul murder? Murder like Schreber was described by Freud in 1911. It's clearly representing an enactment of a severe sadomasochism led by the psychotic split-off voice encouraging the patient to violence, both as an indication of her unconscious identification with the aggressor, as well as the moment of revelation of her victimhood that she wanted me to know. Yet by doing it to me, she was relying, like in Winnicott's discussion of that poem, she was relying on me not retaliating. The capacity for differentiation between her internal cruel parental objects and her analyst, and the establishment of solid boundaries allowed her to know her wish to kill the analyst and to know that he was alive enough to the problem to be able to survive murder. The nightly cutting of the body as an attack on the self was refound in the transference. Her body was the analyst's body, in the same dynamic way that his dog's excrement, my dog, was food for her mouth. My dog sometimes would go out into the courtyard and sometimes shit. And I tried to sort of not allow that, but my patient would find little bits of shit on the way out. And as she left, she'd just pop a bit in her mouth and suck on it. Primitive states of mind. Gradually, I heard about her early childhood, in which she and her younger brother were the sexual objects of her pedophilic parents and their friends. Her mother was totally involved in her husband's perversion. It was the pair of them. And the mother and father put on perverse parties, probably for money, and invited people to come in and do whatever they wanted to do with these two children of, I think, 6 and 8. So this really, in reality, what was underneath the psychosis. That's very important. The next section I've titled The Analyst's Murder of a Session. The reason I'm interested in this pair of ideas on murder is taken from a quote in Ferenzi's diary. Quote, "I've finally come to realize that it is an unavoidable task for the analyst. Although he may behave as he will, he may take kindness and relaxation as far as he possibly can. The time will come," says Ferenzi, "when he will have to repeat with his own hands the act of murder previously perpetrated against the patient." He's talking about transference. He's not meaning that analysts kill patients, but it's a serious business. Some months later, I destroyed a session by terminating it early, as at that moment I could no longer bear the massive daily cutting of my patient's body. This attack had continued for several weeks, and despite all my interpretive attempts, her destructiveness just increased against her arms, her anus, her vagina, and the patient arrived for the last session of the week with even more bandages dangling, bloody ones, commencing the session as if it was utterly separate from what she was showing me of the bodily attack. Within a couple of minutes, and this is important, I found myself asking her to leave. I didn't think I'm going to ask her to leave. I found myself saying, you have to go now. I said, you can come back the following Monday. She rightly confirmed that she'd come at the correct time. I agreed, but said I was unable to work with her for that day. She left perplexed. I felt terrible knowing that she had suddenly and unexpectedly approached my limit of containment. Waiting to see what the following session would bring was agonizing, especially as I expected her to potentially enact a further assault by committing suicide on the road between where she lived and my consulting room. I even thought that she'd put a note on her body saying, I'm Dr. Sklar's patient. I came to my session and he threw me out. I did nothing but stay with the aloneness of pain and the paradox that, in my opinion, the best help was to dare to leave a gap and to trust in the patient's capacity to survive my destruction of her rather than arranging a hospital admission. That's something we might talk about if you want to later. I was assailed by my own demons in my countertransference enactment that I was not a competent analyst. I imagined I'd be struck off the medical register of the United Kingdom, and even worse, thrown out of the British Psychoanalytical Society. Yet I decided to not contact the patient over the weekend. The patient arrived on Monday for the Monday session on time. She looked considerably better in a more alive way, and there were no more dangling bloody bandages for me to see. She began by saying she was very grateful for what I had said and done the previous session, as she understood it as recognition that I cared about her. Implicitly, she also meant that I was not simply allowing sessions to continue in some sort of unconscious collusion with the idea that she could just continue seriously to cut herself as if her body did not matter. I, unlike her perverse parents, could not bear the show. She never cut her body again, and the transference alliance was considerably strengthened. Of course, interpretations about her state have been made in all manner of ways, always falling on stony ground. Historically, this was a repetition, as it seemed that her parents had no concern about any pain inflicted physically on her. Her response to my act was being able to begin to heal the pair of us. It was the first such recognition, and such a piece of analytic work akin to the alarm for the analyst of falling into a deep black hole was the clinical terrain of a potential for creative recovery. The point of being able to enter such an emotionally evocative blackness that was a recreation of her history was that now we could work together more on her historical traumatic narrative, whereas in the past and for most of her life, she had been profoundly alone, repressing her knowledge. Such a clinical atmosphere cannot be taught, but requires a good enough capacity to bear being in that moment and accepting one's fate, a position true for both analyst and analysand. In the presence of such destructive unconscious relationships, if the analyst remains in a clinical position of being only the observer, looking at and commenting on, then the patient realizes often quite quickly that the analyst is not alongside their emotional analytical journey. Rather, the analyst is perceived as speaking a commentary. You're doing this or that, and even linking it to the transference, to do something to me. For those patients who've had a surfeit of destructiveness in life that's left them barely alive emotionally, The process of healing necessitates the revelation of the impact of that destructiveness, both on themselves as a form of expression and on the analyst, with each of the pair taking on different sadistic and masochistic positions as the object is made use of. It's only later in the analysis that this can be interpreted once the patient is in a state of object relating rather than alone. Now, the analyst has to be extremely thorough in examining his own desire for revenge. Of course, such patients expect to be attacked, as this is the life offered by primary objects. The patient may constantly be in a state of expecting that treatment will just be stopped, and may take the opposite form of the patient trying to stop therapy in order to preempt the fantasy of the analyst's punishment of her coming true. Sometimes the patient's expectation of the analyst's desire for revenge in identification with the patient is an accurate reflection of the analyst not being able to stay further in the analytic quagmire. The patient's wish and expectation of being too much for anyone to cope with then comes true. The analyst may think he's done enough in an impossible case, but this needs to perhaps be understood as a revenge motif too. Instead, the analyst can continue to do analysis with the realization that another picture exists beneath the blackness, the blankness. Inpatient psychiatric care needs to be considered. However, if the home situation is amenable enough, analysis of the psychotic state to include such violent fantasies, with the analyst taking all necessary precautions in order to stay with the storm, can result in an analytic movement to a benign state in which interpretive work and the lifting of repression leads to a deep depression for the agony of such an early life. That work on coming to terms with the depressive state is for a later part of the analysis, not earlier. In this paper, I've not dwelt on many and various Oedipal interpretations subsequent to the patient having left the one-person state, as John Rickman wrote a wonderful paper on. The meaning of knives, cuts, bloods, mother, father, sibling, incest, cruelty, sadomasochism. That's for later to be worked out more. So back to the beginning. Freud, 1896. The etiology of hysteria. Freud writes, "It is exactly like putting together a child's picture puzzle. After many attempts, we become absolutely certain in the end which piece belongs in the empty gap. For only that one piece fills out the picture and at the same time allows its irregular edges to be fitted into the edges of the other pieces in such a manner as to leave no space free and to entail no overlapping." It's a wonderful quote from early Freud. "I had by sudden action when I murdered the analytic session and without thought found the missing unconscious piece of the puzzle that stopped the perverse game in her mind." We can now begin to understand the diagnosis that several psychiatrists had formerly made years before, that she had paranoid schizophrenia, itself a cover for the severe pedophilic perversity that was laid on her and her younger brother. Psychotic medication only helped suppress the role of hateful parenting, as if the parents had just been victims themselves by way of having mad kids who grew up to have psychotic and apparently untreatable psychiatric illness. I've got a little bit more. Okay. Bartlett's harmonious mix-up was a description of benign states. He also theorized about malignant states found in severe states of regression. However, in the basic fault, he provides no vignettes for a malignant regression. And I'm trying to fill that lacuna with this case. His wife Enid felt distant from some of his findings about the basic fault, especially in the area of technique about how the analyst deals with or stays alive in regressive states, and was expecting to further her husband's work in the next book, unwritten due to his early death. Rickman, who'd experienced analysis with Freud and then Ferenczi, and later went into analysis with Klein in London, was Enid Balint's training analyst, and after his sudden death in 1951, she continued to be in analysis with Winnicott for many years. My patient was in a one-person state of a great deal of the time, but was also acutely observing me and my availability to be in the room with her. The one-person state that she was often in was not mirrored by me, who was potentially available at any time during the sessions by observing whilst having my own reverie and an unspoken expectation of work happening at the level of unconscious communication. She knew, for instance, that I was always there for every one of her sessions, as well in the gaps of treatment if need be, something of which she never availed herself. I took long summer holidays, as we British psychoanalysts do, and I'd be away for 5 or 6 weeks, and she managed. She didn't want extra sessions. She managed. She knew I needed to have recovery. She managed herself being in analysis. I will, before ending here, look at Mrs. A's own ending. She'd survived, managed, and eventually coped with many summer breaks, but this one was different. She returned as usual and told me she'd noticed a growth on her breast within a few days of the break. She wanted to inform me about this before seeing her general practitioner, which she did the following day after I was back. I was very upset by this start of term, knowing that such pathology requires an urgency in diagnosis, and she had deliberately delayed having a consultation. She was now quickly discovered to have a very malignant breast carcinoma, taking the news with an astonishing calmness. This was the opposite to my inner distress. I came to realize that she'd deliberately used a summer break to think about her life and death, working out her solution. In view of the aggressiveness of her cancer, only severe treatments were offered and were quietly, firmly refused. She was in a quiet, peaceful existential state as she organized her affairs. I came reluctantly to realize that although she knew that analysis had profoundly changed her from being alone in the world, unreachable in our work, in the pain of her horrific childhood with her parents, and despite knowing that in our work she found that she could trust another person, the aggression that she suffered from was too much for her to accept as psychic pain. It seemed that the internal aggression had returned as a severe somatization attack on her breast that was unstoppable, and she quickly died. Her death left me pondering for many years, and it's only more recently that I can begin closure by describing the end of her analysis. She was able to have a quiet and even impressive going towards death that I thought was a mark of deep respect for the analytic work we had both participated in. So, is this a return of the death drive? For Freud, the death and destructive drive was characterized by compulsive repetition and destructiveness. And although it may be attached to pleasure and excitement, it's not governed by the logic of wish fulfillment. Paula Hyman, writing after the schism with Melanie Klein, when she was a member of the independent group, wrote, "What then is death instinct? There are many situations when our patients tell us and show us that they want to be dead. I believe it's more correct to say that they want to be dead than to say they want to die. Indeed, analysis reveals that the wish in question concerns a state that is painless, while the fact of dying is usually strongly invested with fantasies of pain. Behind the wish to be dead, what one really finds is the wish to be free of pain, whether physical or psychical, such as shame, guilt, intolerable fears, anxiety, depression, confusion, despairs, and so on. Or we find fantasy wishes to be revenged upon or to kill an object with which the patient has unconsciously identified. A fairly typical revenge fantasy that is preconscious consists of imagining one's parents in a state of terrible guilt, suffering from remorse, accusing each other over their child's grave. Here, an Oedipal wish is concealed behind the wish to be dead, unquote. Here, Paula Hyman is turning away from Freud's description of a return to an inanimate state. Being inanimate for her is an expression of negativism, indifference, contempt for pain, and lack of self-interest. These are states of mind of an opposite formation to that of creative life, fragments of dissociative mind, as found in psychosis, severe manic depressive states, and perversion, formed in the actual traumas of infancy and childhood. Hyman eventually states, quote, "Personally, what I no longer find convincing is the relation between the hypothetical death instinct and the primary destructive drive. The importance of this later work lies in its description of her giving up the seductive pull of inertia and primary destructiveness." Now, Kleinians regard the latter as a central concept and view an analysis without such introspective theoretical discussion as superficial. I would argue that such a position diminishes the historical findings of the various intrusions into the body and mind of some babies, children, and adolescents discovered through transference and countertransference. I'm also distancing myself from Barlint's idea of primary love because I think it's too charming. Hyman's clinical description, like Winnicott's child covering the colorful painting with black, reveals the possibility of finding an analysis what used to exist before the true self was protected and covered over by the false self. And now I suggest it be worthwhile to read or reread Ferencz's seminal extraordinary paper, Confusion of Tongues Between the Adult and the Child, the Language of Tenderness and of Passion, and to compare the descriptions alongside Mrs. A. So much of the pedophilic cruelty that she sustained in childhood and adolescence had been faced in analysis. I'm just going to skip the next short paragraph. I would like to mention before I end that my patient had trained as a teacher and in time was a very gifted headmistress who established a very well-regarded school. She could recognize similarly damaged children and kindly help them to some recovery, respite, and protection, which her school allowed. She was very well known to be committed to helping impossible to help children. I will leave the last sentences to my patient with a poem of hers, containing a deep metaphorical description of her living with her destroyed self, the act of a poetic formation itself being a strand of her recovery and of her death. I do not live in the past. The past lies in the present here with me. Not past are the hands that tear and claw. Not past are the torments and the unshed tears. The past envelops and smothers the present and reaches out to pull the wings off the future. I cannot say bury the past because the dead rise from their corruption and the stench of decay continually deflowers me as I suck the final trumpet of despair. Thank you.
Gracias, Jonathan. Coqui, a ver si le pones palabra a la transparencia y al dolor que Jonathan nos ha traído.
Ahora sí. Ok, gracias. Buenos días. Entonces, también quiero yo expresar mi agradecimiento a la Universidad Católica, a la Sociedad Peruana de Psicoanálisis que nos acoge. Ambas son mi alma mater, como la de muchos de los presentes. A la proverbial y discreta generosidad de Moisés Lemlich, sin cuya presencia la Cátedra Británica sencillamente no sería posible. Gracias al infatigable trabajo de Carla Mantilla, que está detrás de todo lo que estamos haciendo hoy. Y gracias, Doris, por revelar uno de mis oscuros secretos. Felizmente, después leíste la cláusula de confidencialidad y estamos entre amigos, así que cuento con eso. Pero sobre todo, quiero decir que es un enorme privilegio comentar el trabajo de un amigo querido, a quien admiro y respeto y de quien aprendo siempre, Jonathan Sklar. Y la tarea de comentar su trabajo es a un tiempo sencilla y extremadamente compleja. Sencilla porque su finura, analítica y profundidad saltan a la vista. Y en ese sentido no hay gran cosa por agregar, salvo practicar el arte del elogio. Pero es compleja también porque más allá de su virtuosismo analítico, lo hace con un supremo arte de la narración, que nos mantiene en el filo de la butaca, por así decirlo, hasta la última línea. Me emocionó tanto que hasta le puse título a mi comentario. Lupus in fábula. Voy a explicar por qué después. Este es un ejemplo ideal y brillante del trabajo analítico británico, tal como lo entiende el grupo de los independientes. Quisiera dejarlo ahí y dar paso a las preguntas que seguramente ustedes quieren plantearle, pero voy a tratar de cumplir con el encargo de hacer algunos breves comentarios. Al presentarnos un material que parte desde la regresión y la somatización, lo cual constituye un formidable desafío para el analista, pues debe intentar ponerse en contacto con un self reacio al ingreso de la luz. Para decirlo metafóricamente, no pude evitar pensar en mis referentes franceses, en la locura privada de André Green, en la construcción del espacio analítico de Serge Wiedemann, y tareas que Jonathan enfrenta con singular maestría, aquella que solo puede provenir de un riguroso entrenamiento y una escucha extremadamente sensible. En estos casos, el sistema defensivo tiene su propia economía psíquica, por así decirlo, y el analista aparece como una intrusión amenazante. En la mente del analizado, enraizada en lo psicosomático, el analista aparece como un burócrata que entorpece su trabajo de autoprotección, aquel del falso self. Caparazón que Jonathan procura traspasar hasta llegar al verdadero self, que lo preexistía antes de las atroces experiencias traumáticas que nos acaba de relatar. El analista puede alterar esta dinámica en la medida que el paciente lo reconozca como un ser capaz, por vez primera, de escucharla sin hacerle daño. El burócrata arbitrario y sádico, el de los relatos de Kafka, se transforma poco a poco en el barquero que puede llevarlos a ambos a la otra orilla del río Estigia, el límite entre la tierra y el Hades, el mundo de los muertos. Y puesto que aludimos a espacios transicionales, la extraordinaria canción de cuna citada por Winnicott, no la recuerdo de memoria, pero es una de esas canciones para arrullar al bebito para que se duerma, que es algo así como que la cuna está en una rama de un árbol y mientras la mamá lo arrulla, la rama se rompe y la cuna se cae con el bebé adentro, ¿no? Y sin embargo es una canción tierna y dulce para que los niños se duerman. La madre no es consciente, probablemente nos dice Jonathan, de la letra y entonces la canta de una manera maternal. No encuentro un equivalente en español de la misma índole de letra, pero las madres aquí presentes pueden corroborar algo que todos hemos escuchado, esos típicos comentarios como lo estamparía contra la pared. Sin embargo, la diferencia es que estos comentarios expresan sin ambajes el odio contenido y llevado a la broma por la madre, mas no conozco pues canción de cuna alguna con la contundencia de la británica, que sin embargo sirve para arrullar a un bebé. Si bien este odio ocasional contra el bebé puede o no derivar en masoquismo, como parte de una cadena transgeneracional, cabe preguntarse si no es precisa cierta dosis de masoquismo para tolerar las demandas infantiles, la cual, siguiendo a Jonathan, debe ser distinguida de la prevalencia de dicho par antitético al sadismo, como se observa en la canción de cuna o en los ejemplos citados, en donde la capacidad de contener el odio del bebé corre pareja con la menos admitida, social, cultural e individualmente, del odio de la madre hacia su progenie. Salvo, claro está, en los no tan infrecuentes casos de pasajes al acto que hacen las delicias de la prensa amarilla. Jonathan nos recuerda con necesaria pertinencia que la metapsicología freudiana, lejos de ser teorías abstractas solo para eruditos, proceden de las interacciones humanas más íntimas y esenciales. Así, las representaciones de cosa y palabra que muchos analistas estudian en los institutos y luego descartan, pues no las ven como herramientas clínicas útiles para su práctica cotidiana, son sin embargo el terroir en el que crece la viña y las viñetas clínicas. Las palabras del analista, nos señala Jonathan, pueden ser percibidas como cosas por el analizado, la analizada en este caso, quien las experimenta físicamente como seducción o agresión. Yo encuentro una analogía entre este abandono progresivo de la metapsicología con la progresiva disminución del estudio de humanidades en las universidades del mundo entero por no ser económicamente rentables, lo cual va cada vez más en provecho de lo que en el mundo universitario se conoce como lo STEM, por sus siglas en inglés: ciencias, tecnología, ingeniería y matemáticas. En otra referencia a la riqueza creativa de Winnicott, Jonathan nos cuenta el caso de ese niño que hacía pinturas de colores brillantes. Me pregunto si la The Hallucination, la citada por Jonathan, equivale a la alucinación negativa de Freud, que puede ser explicada como el borrado activo de una percepción. Me parece haberle escuchado esta definición a André Green. El asunto es que el niño, tras haber pintado esta escena vívida y colorida, la cubría con una capa de negro. Y de inmediato acudió a mi memoria un pintor que siempre me ha fascinado, Pierre Soulages. Murió el año pasado, tenía 102 años. Todos vamos a llegar ahí. Se le conoce como el pintor del negro, por su uso sistemático de ese color. Soulages, con su outre noir, concepto por él creado, mal traducido como otro negro, eso sería autre noir. Esto es outre noir, como en outre-mer es ultramar, es decir, esto es ultranegro. Nos enseña la vía de la sublimación, pero asimismo este proceso con fases de destrucción y construcción que en el caso del analista permite regresionar con el paciente hasta la experiencia traumática velada y a la vez representada por el ultranegro. Soulages sobre el negro, lo cito. Al mismo tiempo, es un color y un no color. Cuando la luz se refleja en el negro, lo transforma y transmuta. Abre un campo mental propio. Soy consciente de haber citado, y lo voy a hacer una vez más, André Green siempre, no siempre, en uno de sus textos, o en más de uno, dice que en realidad cuando un analista se confronta con la obra de arte, no lo hace para analizar la obra de arte, es la obra de arte la que nos analiza a nosotros. Pero ahora quisiera citar, ya me toca, ¿no es cierto? Yo tengo esta insistencia con lo propio, con no caer en la fascinación. Es maravilloso tener una cátedra británica, ojalá tuviéramos también una francesa, pero ustedes saben cuánto insisto, por lo menos los que me conocen de cerca, en la importancia de nunca perder de vista de dónde venimos, quiénes somos, cuál es la realidad en la que nos desarrollamos. Así que voy a citar a un poeta venezolano, a Andrés Eloy Blanco. Él quizá no lo conocen, pero lo que les voy a citar estoy seguro que sí. Dice: pintor nacido en mi tierra con el pincel extranjero, pintor que sigues el rumbo de tantos pintores viejos. Aunque la Virgen sea blanca, píntame angelitos negros. La canción que muchos deben conocer es de otra persona, del mexicano Manuel Álvarez Maciste. Este apasionante trabajo de Jonathan continúa y nos confronta con la eventualidad de pacientes como la suya, la señora A, con severas fallas en la conformación de su entorno, en donde el analista puede ser percibido, en la transferencia se entiende, como el agresor, el atacante. Lupus in fábula. El lobo entra en el cuento infantil y el analista es el lobo que se va a comer a la niña, pero se la va a comer de verdad, como en la versión original de Charles Perrault del siglo XVIII. La enorme dificultad de trabajar con pacientes tan dañados en sus fundamentos puede hacer que el analista considere la negrura como el lecho de roca, ¿no? Con lo cual, nos dice Jonathan, el paciente probablemente, si es que el analista se queda ahí, abandonará el tratamiento por este enactment del analista. Una pequeña digresión para contarles que siempre me ha intrigado la traducción al español de enactment, pero en el sentido que tiene en psicoanálisis. Estaba buscando en mi celular, en el Merriam-Webster que tengo ahí, el diccionario de inglés, y bueno, me salió una traducción clásica, ¿no? De enactment en el sentido, digamos, general de la palabra, pero de pronto apareció, pop-up, ¿no? De golpe, una publicidad del ahora célebre chat GPT, que para mí es, ¿no? Una extraña lengua, y dije, bueno, ya, a ver qué pasa. Entonces me bajé la aplicación y le pregunté al chat GPT ¿Cómo se traduce en sentido psicoanalítico la palabra enactment? Y aquí está su respuesta. En el sentido psicoanalítico se puede traducir enactment como representación o actuación. Se utiliza para describir la recreación inconsciente por parte del paciente de experiencias pasadas o traumas a través de su comportamiento, gestos, palabras o reacciones emocionales en la relación con el terapeuta durante el proceso terapéutico. Fin de la cita. Más adelante, Jonathan acude al concepto de basic fault de Michael Balint, que solemos traducir como falta básica. Pero el nuevo gran otro me corrigió, porque también le pregunté. En español se suele traducir, me dijo, basic fault como falta básica. Sin embargo, hay quienes prefieren denominarla falla básica. Como muestra, cito, esta frase del libro de Balint, La falta básica, aspectos terapéuticos de la regresión, una falla en la estructura básica de la personalidad, algo parecido a un defecto o una cicatriz. Y luego Jonathan acude a otra persona de apellido Balint, no por casualidad, Enid Balint, para recordarnos que antes de entrar al proceso de reconocimiento de la presencia del otro, es preciso atravesar una etapa de creatividad solitaria. Y sustrae a este proceso de cualquier atisbo de romanticismo, sentimentalismo o positivismo vital. Nos recuerda que Winnicott insiste en las experiencias de destrucción y supervivencia como partes inherentes del proceso. Se trata más bien de un viaje épico, propio de una epopeya. Con delicadeza, a la par que con mano firme, Jonathan nos lleva a esos paisajes oscuros, fríos, inhóspitos, él tiene un libro sobre esto, del mundo interno de pacientes como el suyo. Como esas escenas de las películas del gran cineasta ruso Tarkovsky, de páramos desolados, producto de alguna catástrofe cuyo origen el gran cineasta deja a criterio del espectador. El analista, Jonathan, tiene que atravesar este paisaje inhóspito y peligroso en la mente dañada del analizanda. En Stalker, por ejemplo, una de sus grandes películas, hay una escena de un hombre tirado en uno de esos parajes y a sus pies lo mira un lobo negro, lupus in fabula. Finalmente, como lo han escuchado, ante la carencia de viñetas clínicas de Balint, Jonathan nos ofrece una particularmente dramática y al mismo tiempo hermosa. Con un singular talento narrativo nos lleva paso a paso en el viaje interior de la señora A. Cuando nos dice, por ejemplo, que su caparazón de persona conocida como protectora en la comunidad desaparecía, no bien ingresaba al consultorio y se sentaba arrinconada en el suelo, nos da una pista de la interacción entre su falso self y el verdadero, como nos lo mostrará tan claramente al final. Gradualmente el dolor de la paciente se torna transitivo. Pero la señora A necesita constatarlo con miradas furtivas, cuyo significado o significados Jonathan debe interpretar en una variedad de combinatorias como solo se pueden encontrar en el caleidoscopio de la transferencia y contratransferencia. Como un funámbulo en la cuerda floja, una de cuyas eventuales actuaciones es la que los espectadores tanto temen como secretamente desean, que se caiga. La paciente existe en el fragor de esa ambivalencia. Cuando Jonathan titula una parte de la viñeta como el deseo del paciente de asesinar al analista, lo primero en lo que uno piensa son esas clásicas fantasías kleinianas que solo suceden en la mente del paciente. Pero no en este caso. Como ustedes lo han escuchado, a partir de ese momento, la viñeta clínica que Jonathan ha compartido con nosotros da un giro sorprendente y adquiere ribetes novelescos, pero de novela negra. El crimen ingresa en el consultorio, pero no de manera metafórica, sino real y vívida, incluso aterradora. Toda esta historia tremenda del cuchillo, ¿no? La presencia del arma del crimen en el escenario del consultorio, el cuchillo en el bolso de la paciente y la intuición previa del analista que le permite percibir la amenaza latente, así como su delicado manejo de la misma cuando recibe el cuchillo, ponen en marcha una serie de procesos de altísima complejidad. Uno de los más determinantes para la continuación del análisis es que la paciente descubre que el analista va a sobrevivir a su deseo de asesinarlo con el arma filosa, la misma con la que se cortaba de manera terrible a sí misma. Y recién, a partir de esta escena, de esta etapa, puede contarle los abusos pedófilos de los cuales fueron víctimas ella y su hermano menor por obra de sus padres y de los amigos de los padres, en fin, toda esta barbarie. Esta vez es el turno del analista, en la segunda parte, de actuar el crimen asesinando la sesión, nos dice Jonathan, interrumpiéndola a los 2 minutos. Ni Lacan se había atrevido a tanto. Jonathan queda sumido en una angustia incoercible. Lo van a expulsar del colegio médico, de la Sociedad Británica de Psicoanálisis, del planeta Tierra. Y sin embargo, logra no llamar a la paciente durante todo el fin de semana. Una tarea heroica. Los demonios de la contratransferencia, nos ha dicho, como a las Banshees de Inisherin, de esta reciente película que transcurre en una isla irlandesa, lo acosan y atormentan. Pero su actuación rinde sus frutos. Jonathan rompe lanzas con la creciente tendencia a diagnosticar y tratar psiquiátricamente, en este caso con una etiqueta de esquizofrenia paranoica que encubría la severa perversión pedófila de los padres. La medicación antipsicótica, nos dice, solo suprimía el rol de la paternidad impregnada de odio, colocando a los padres en el lugar de las víctimas en vez de que lo estén los hijos. Esta afirmación es un genuino desafío a las corrientes actuales que buscan soluciones drásticas, incompatibles con el proceso de subjetivación y sus tiempos propios del psicoanálisis. Estoy terminando. Como si el caso no fuese ya un viaje digno de la Odisea de Ulises, faltaba una última vuelta de tuerca que nos deja, por lo menos a mí, confrontados con la insondable profundidad a la que puede acceder un análisis con la maestría con la que lo navegan Jonathan y su analizanda. La muerte de la paciente, que Jonathan nos dice, es, entre otras cosas, un homenaje, porque ella decide no seguir con esa medicación, ¿recuerdan? Pesada y terrible. Él la ve como un homenaje respetuoso al trabajo analítico que realizaron juntos. Y nos cuenta que a él le tomó años cerrar este proceso, por supuesto no es para menos. Termino citando a Wisława Szymborska, una inmensa poeta polaca, como un homenaje a los ancestros de Jonathan Sklar. Es una línea. Pido perdón a las grandes preguntas por las nimias respuestas. Muchas gracias por su paciencia.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Coqui. Tenemos 10 minutos para poder dar algunos comentarios o un intercambio, preguntas de parte de ustedes. 5, 15. $12. Ok. Para poder hacer algún intercambio, la posibilidad de, ¿no?, generar preguntas, ¿no?, abrir el diálogo tanto a lo que el doctor Sklar como Coqui Bruce nos han podido mostrar hoy. Si es que apoyan, por favor, entre público, van pasando el micro, ¿sí?
Hola. Bueno, muchas gracias por esta presentación. La verdad ha sido muy sentida, o sea, la ha transmitido desde un corazón abierto y muchísimas gracias por eso. Y nada, pensaba en esto, me quedé pensando con esto de el asesinato de la sesión. Y no sé, pensaba, es que usted se convirtió en el asesino de la sesión o de la paciente, porque no sé, yo pensaba que es como un asesinato, pero quizás a ese padre de la horda, ¿no? A ese mundo preedípico en donde todo se puede y todo se confunde y se sigue repitiendo la crueldad y todas las pulsiones sin ningún límite y sin ningún cuidado y sin ningún registro de lo que está pasando. Y siento que por eso es como que termina siendo fundante, ¿no?, en el proceso, como ese no que dice, no, esto no va más, ¿no? Y que creo que además era necesario todo ese proceso previo en donde usted le dio cabida y lugar a ese mundo de ella y se metió adentro y lo vivió con ella para luego decir, ya no más, ¿no? O sea, pensaba eso.
Muchas gracias. Continuando un poco con el comentario, yo quería aproximarnos a comprender qué pasa con la señora A ese fin de semana, mientras Jonathan sufre terriblemente. Ella sale a esos 2 minutos con algo que da una señal que el analista existe. Hay una señal de que le está afectando algo, algo está pasando. Me ayudaría a entender un poco qué es lo que ella devela en algún momento de lo que ella procesa ese fin de semana o los días siguientes, que la ayuda a sentir, a experimentar que existes como algo, existes o analiza como alguien, ¿no?, en ese momento.
Hola, quería hacer un comentario sobre el caso que comentó el jueves, el caso social y este caso. Encontraba que en ambos hay grupos, o un paciente y un grupo destruido por su contexto, ¿no? algo que los ha destruido y ha impedido que se conecten de repente en la sesión o en esa intervención grupal de manera óptima. Entonces, esta parte que les impide realmente conectarse me hace pensar un poco en cómo pensar en el contexto en el psicoanálisis más concreto, más real, que ataca de repente a la persona del grupo. Es algo de repente que, a menos he sentido que cuando uno se entrena en psicoanálisis, un poco de repente no lo piensa mucho, o quizás se enfoca más en lo intrapsíquico, en lo que está dentro. Al menos he sentido yo eso un poco ciertas veces, y me pareció interesante quizá reconocer que esto externo tiene este impacto interno, y luego cómo se manifiesta y cómo se puede acoger pensando ambas partes. Me pareció eso muy, muy interesante.
Adelante.
I would like to ask you, first of all, ¿sí? Voy a hablar en castellano entonces. I have to talk now. Antes que nada, agradecerte, Jonathan, porque de verdad es un trabajo que toca muy profundamente, ¿no? Nos ha hecho vibrar a todos, nos ha hecho tocar, digamos, núcleos muy internos y darnos cuenta de que el análisis no es una cosa de 2 años, de 3 años, ¿no? Cuando tú hablas sobre qué importante tocar la psicosis y no dejarnos llevar, digamos, inmediatamente mandando al paciente a un hospital, sino estar el analista y el paciente en el campo analítico, dispuestos a involucrarse emocionalmente todo el camino para poder traspasar esa negrura, ¿no? Ese blackness, ¿no? Y poder finalmente tocar esos traumas que si no hubieran estado escondidos para siempre, ¿no? O sea, yo siento que nos estás contando la historia de un análisis de tu paciente contigo y cómo te ha costado tanto trabajo, cuánto trabajo emocional has hecho con tu paciente, los dos juntos, que al final se enfrenta a una muerte tranquila, ¿no? Como parte de la vida también, ¿no? Como también lo que decía Winnicott, ¿no? Quiero estar vivo cuando muera, ¿no? Me parece bien importante eso y realmente agradezco, que a mí me parece que ha sido un trabajo clínico extraordinario. Muchas gracias.
Sí, una intervención breve nada más a raíz de los comentarios de Carmen Labarte, que fue profesora mía en la formación, y recordé que en la formación ella nos comentó un caso de ella, sumamente difícil porque la paciente no hablaba y era muy retador, ella estaba en su formación al mismo tiempo, ¿no? Y pensaba cómo hay situaciones donde la angustia que no tiene palabra para los pacientes, ¿no? Exige esta presencia del analista, que no abdica a poner en palabra las cosas, pero que tolera la ausencia de la palabra, ¿no? Y pensaba que también a través de ese trabajo vemos 2 comunidades en juego que actúan en el espacio del análisis. La paciente y toda esta historia con estos padres, este grupo familiar y estos adultos, este mundo adulto tan violento y perverso, intolerable, difícil de pensar, y que es extraordinario que esta paciente haya llegado a la adultez sin suicidarse antes, ¿no? Y a la vez pensaba en la posición tuya, Jonathan, como analista, ¿no? Y tu comunidad, que son estos autores que citas, con los cuales nos introduces para entrar a la sesión y que probablemente te han acompañado a poder pensar la pertenencia a una institución, todo este trabajo que nos da una red, ¿no? Para no estar solos en la soledad del consultorio, ¿no? Pensaba en eso, en esta otra dimensión que a veces no la pensamos, pensamos en el analista también como muy solitario, ¿no? Entonces quería comentarte eso. Gracias.
Muy brevemente, agradecer, en verdad, estoy todavía tocada por escuchar el caso. También me gustó mucho tu comentario, Coqui. Yo voy a hacer un comentario, dos pequeñas cosas que has soltado. Una es ese comportamiento aparentemente bizarro de la paciente de comer las heces de tu perro, ¿no? Yo he pasado por una cosa así con una paciente que se comía las heces, no del consultorio, pero sí de su hámster muerto en su casa, ¿no? Como una manera de retener, de introyectar, una manera súper primitiva, oral, pero oral anal, ¿no? Pero una manera de retener algo de alguna manera. Y la otra cosa que quisiera puntualizar es en los años que te ha llevado elaborar esto, ¿no? Y que a veces cuando acaba un análisis difícil, de cualquier manera, en este caso fue tremendo porque la paciente muere, pero muere en paz, parece, ¿no? Pero no es que se vaya el paciente, ¿no? Uno se queda con muchas cosas que va elaborando por capas a través de los años, ¿no? Eso quería puntualizar nada más, porque no queda uno indemne después de una experiencia como esta, ¿no? Gracias.
Muy breve, solo quiero agradecer un montón, Jonathan, por todo lo que nos has entregado en esta semana, porque te has entregado y te has mostrado, y creo que es la única forma en que se puede transmitir particularmente el psicoanálisis. Y también a Coqui, porque me has ayudado a digerir un poco todo esto, y sobre todo quiero agradecer el impacto emocional con el que me quedo. Realmente muchas gracias.
Yo me he sentido obligado a intervenir porque creo que Jonathan nos ha mostrado cómo solo el profundo respeto a una tradición se decanta a través de tu maestría en el caso clínico que nos has presentado. Creo que esto es extraordinariamente importante y se pone más claramente de relieve tras la intervención de Jorge Bruce, que nos plantea la necesidad actual en nuestra sociedad psicoanalítica de rescatar las diversas tradiciones que han ido convergiendo en su propio proceso histórico. Está de más señalar tu maestría. Tengo que recurrir a una manera mixta de decirlo en español y en inglés. Ha sido demasiado too much.
Quería agradecer igualmente.
Perdón, simplemente anunciar que es la última intervención. ¿Sí?
Ya. Bueno, quería agradecer mucho las intervenciones, tanto de Jonathan como de Coqui. Creo que hay algo que se me iba aclarando mientras tú ibas desarrollando el caso. Y es que la historia del paciente, de tu paciente es también la historia de la producción analítica, de la clínica que tú, voy a tomar el término de Max, con tanta maestría nos has puesto por delante. Desde Freud, Winnicott, Ferenczi, Balint, todos autores que nos han enriquecido, que forman parte de nuestro acervo analítico. Finalmente, quiero poner de relieve una imagen que quedó muy fuerte en mí, que creo que es cuando tú le dices a la paciente que ya no puede seguir en la sesión y que creo que nos hace ver tu profunda humanidad frente al dolor, tu compasión, que creo que es algo que ha tocado a la paciente muy profundamente. A diferencia de sus padres, tú no permaneces indiferente al espectáculo terrible al que ella te somete, ¿no? Y creo que ese hecho es clave para la recuperación, por llamarlo así, de una dimensión humana en tu paciente. Muchas gracias por todo.
Gracias por las intervenciones. Quería, durante toda la presentación del doctor Sklar, vino a mi mente Eileen Carol Wuornos. Ella es una norteamericana, es la primera asesina en serie estadounidense. Asesinó a 7 hombres. Tuvo una infancia muy parecida a la paciente A, ¿no? Padres pedófilos que la vendían amistades a ella y a su hermano. Me venía a la mente porque justamente cuando Rocío decía que no sabía cómo la paciente A no se había suicidado antes. Bueno, pueden haber varios destinos. Esta mujer fue condenada a la pena de muerte por inyección letal. Y nunca quiso denunciar su historia infantil y tampoco denunciar la violación que sufrió frente a estos 7 hombres cuando ella ejercía como trabajadora sexual. Simplemente hay varios destinos. Podemos jugárnosla por cambiar algunos. Gracias.
Thank you all very much for your reception of my paper. There isn't time to say many things. I'm going to disappear in a few minutes to Cusco, which is part of my recovery from this extraordinary week. I'm very grateful to you for your response. I want to see it in English, not in. I'm very worried about the chat because I think that's got nothing to do with human beings, and it's in a sense rather dangerous. The answer quickly in a way to what happened was, I think that I didn't give her an interpretation. I didn't have one to give her, and it wouldn't have made any difference. I gave her an experience. I was in the experience with her. I had to experience what happened as well. We were both in a very complicated experience, but it was one that she was able to receive and use. I mean, the use of an object. But it couldn't have happened without all the work that had gone on before. And one didn't know that morning what was going to happen. So that's the life of an analyst. I mean, listening to what you were saying back to me, I also realized that I've had an absolute hatred of British psychiatry in the sense of patients are not listened to. Psychiatrists are there for ward rounds once a week where they pontificate, should we put the drugs up or down? And patients are not listened to at all. So the idea of sending, quotes, a suicidal patient to an environment of a mental hospital where that will go on probably, unless they meet a kind nurse or somebody, to my mind is like pushing the patient away, pushing them out. And it doesn't interest me. But I am interested in the possibility for some analysts to do work like this, to carry on exposing humanity against psychiatry. And I think that's an enormous matter. And you know, a lot of money is put into psychiatry, very little money is put into psychoanalytic psychotherapy and psychoanalysis in the National Health Service. And this has to be thought about. So I'm looking back and thinking that one reason for writing this paper going into the future is to say, you know, you can listen to patients. It's a hell of a lot of work, but then so's doing a heart transplant, which I think is the equivalent. So make use of this object, think about it. And I shall as well think about this encounter, which has been very rich here in Lima, and I've been very pleased to work with you, and it's been a great pleasure, and the food has been wonderful, of course. We have all much to think about, and even though you're right, it's too much, there's no way around that. I mean, so is the violence of what's going on in the world at the moment, and the destruction, it's too much. We have to suffer that and somehow find ways of surviving it, which are about humankind, the kindness of humans to each other. Okay.
Bueno, invito a Chela y a Carla a cerrar la cátedra, a Moisés, como corresponde, dado que es el trabajo y el esfuerzo de ellos.
Bueno, ha sido para todos, para todas, un enorme placer, un gusto muy grande reencontrarnos, además en la Casa de la Sociedad Peruana de Psicoanálisis después de tanto tiempo, y que se haya animado tanta gente a venir también. No es gratuito, tiene mucho que ver con Cátedra Británica, ¿no? El aniversario de la sociedad, que lo celebramos con la conferencia anual Múltiple Interés del Psicoanálisis, y la presencia de Jonathan, tu forma de ser. Creo que ha permitido que hoy sábado estemos todos acá reunidos, y nuevamente gracias a Moisés, ¿no? el inventor de esta semana de Cátedra Británica.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos y a todas y a todes por estar aquí esta mañana. Gracias a Jonathan, a todos los que participaron en las supervisiones, en la discusión clínica. Y bueno, creo que lo que me gustaría resaltar es algo que les contaba el día de la inauguración de la cátedra, y es la alegría, el gusto de haber podido volver a realizarla manteniendo el esquema presencial, ¿no? Porque creo que hoy, con todos los comentarios que ustedes han dicho y con el tan sentido texto de Jonathan, se ve con mucho más claridad lo importante que es vivirlo en directo y en persona, ¿no? Porque digamos, la Cátedra de Psicoanálisis Británico no solamente es un esquema de exposición y recepción, sino es un intercambio de experiencias, es un intercambio de lenguajes, de discursos y de prácticas. Con eso cierro, les agradezco muchísimo. Esperemos tener en 2 años, si otra pandemia no nos asalta, una nueva, la 5ª edición de la Cátedra de Psicoanálisis Británico, siempre integrando a la universidad con la sociedad psicoanalítica. Muchas gracias a todos.
Y ahí nos espera un cafecito y cosas ricas para aguantar hasta el almuerzo. Muchas gracias.